The day you disappear forever from a narcissist's life is not the day they suddenly realize how much they loved you. It's the day they realize they have lost something they believed they would always control. And what happens next surprises almost everyone. Their reactions often look like love, regret, or heartbreak, but underneath, something very different is happening. By the end of this video, you'll understand why their behavior changes so dramatically once they know you're truly gone. Before we begin, I want you to think about one question. Have you ever watched someone ignore you for months, only to suddenly chase you the moment you stopped caring? If you've lived through that experience, you're not imagining things. Share your experience in the comments, not to expose anyone, but because your story may help someone else recognize patterns they haven't been able to explain. If this discussion is helping you understand behaviors that once left you confused, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Every week we break down unhealthy relationship dynamics, emotional manipulation, and the psychology behind them so you can recognize the patterns sooner and protect your peace. Now, let's continue with one of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic relationships. The moment you leave a narcissist for good, something happens that most people completely misunderstand. Many assume the narcissist is devastated because they have lost the person they claimed to love. But in reality, what often shakes them first is not the loss of the relationship itself. It is the loss of what that relationship provided. This distinction is uncomfortable, yet it explains why their reactions can seem so confusing. They may suddenly become emotional, persistent, or desperate, not because they have developed empathy overnight, but because an important source of validation, attention, admiration, or control has disappeared. In psychology, this is often described as the loss of narcissistic supply, the external reinforcement that helps sustain an inflated sense of self. Healthy relationships are built on mutual care, respect, and emotional reciprocity. Each person values the other as a unique individual with independent thoughts and feelings. In an unhealthy narcissistic dynamic, however, the partner can gradually become less of an equal and more of a mirror, reflecting approval, reassurance, or emotional energy back to the narcissist. When that mirror walks away permanently, the loss feels intensely personal because it challenges the image they have carefully constructed of themselves. The silence you leave behind becomes difficult to explain, not only to others, but also to their own fragile sense of identity. This is why their behavior may suddenly appear inconsistent. Someone who dismissed your needs yesterday may now act as though they cannot live without you. Someone who seemed emotionally detached may urgently seek contact, make promises, or attempt to pull you back into familiar patterns. These actions can look like deep love from the outside, but appearances can be misleading. Genuine love involves accountability, empathy, and respect for another person's autonomy. A fear of losing influence is something entirely different. Understanding this difference is one of the most important steps toward breaking free from confusion. It helps you stop interpreting every dramatic reaction as proof of hidden affection and start recognizing that losing access to someone is not the same as losing the ability to genuinely love them. When you are gone forever, one of the first reactions a narcissist may experience is not sadness in the way most people understand it. Instead, it is often something psychologists refer to as a narcissistic injury. This is not simply disappointment or heartbreak. It is a profound blow to an inflated sense of self that depends heavily on feeling admired, important, or in control. To someone with strong narcissistic traits, your permanent departure is more than the end of a relationship. It is evidence that someone they believed would always remain within their influence has chosen a different path. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it challenges the belief that they are always the one who decides when a relationship begins or ends. This is why their initial response may seem surprisingly intense or unpredictable. Rather than quietly processing the loss, they may react with anger, disbelief, or attempts to rewrite what happened. They might insist that you were the problem, criticize your character, or tell others a version of events that protects their image. In some cases, they become unusually calm on the surface while privately feeling consumed by frustration. The common thread is that the emotional reaction is often centered on the injury to their ego rather than on understanding your experience or respecting your decision. For many survivors, this stage is especially confusing because the narcissist's emotions can appear genuine. They may cry, express outrage, or suddenly describe you as the most important person in their life. While these reactions can feel convincing, intense emotion alone does not necessarily reflect empathy or accountability. A person can be overwhelmed by losing control without truly acknowledging the pain they caused. That distinction matters because it helps explain why dramatic apologies or emotional displays do not always lead to meaningful change. Lasting change requires self-reflection, responsibility, and a willingness to examine harmful patterns over time. Understanding narcissistic injury also helps remove the mystery from their behavior. What appears to be overwhelming love may actually be overwhelming damage to their self-image. When you recognize that difference, you become less likely to mistake emotional intensity for emotional maturity. You begin to see that protecting your peace is not an act of cruelty, but an act of clarity, especially when someone's strongest reaction begins only after they realize they can no longer control your presence in their life. One of the most confusing moments after leaving a narcissistic relationship is when the person who seemed completely indifferent suddenly finds a reason to come back. They may send an unexpected message months later, ask mutual friends about you, react to your social media, offer an apology that never came before, or create what appears to be a chance encounter. To someone who has been longing for closure, these actions can feel like undeniable proof that the narcissist has finally recognized your value. But before assigning meaning to the behavior, it is important to understand what may actually be driving it. This pattern is commonly known as hoovering, a term used to describe attempts to draw someone back into a relationship or interaction after they have pulled away. Hoovering can take many forms. Sometimes it is affectionate, filled with compliments, promises, or declarations of change. Other times it is subtle, such as sending a simple "How have you been?" message or reminding you of a shared memory. In more aggressive cases, it may involve guilt, blame, or creating a crisis that pressures you to respond. Although these approaches look different, they often serve the same purpose: testing whether the emotional connection and influence still exist. What makes this so difficult is that the behavior can resemble genuine remorse. After all, healthy people sometimes reach out after realizing they made mistakes. The difference is not found in the message itself, but in the pattern that follows. Genuine accountability includes consistent actions, respect for boundaries, and a willingness to accept your decision even if it is painful. Manipulative re-engagement, on the other hand, often fades once reassurance, attention, or renewed access has been restored. If the underlying dynamics remain unchanged, the cycle frequently repeats itself. This is why many people are caught off guard when the narcissist suddenly reappears just as they begin to heal. Your growing independence signals that you are no longer emotionally available in the same way, and that change can trigger renewed efforts to reconnect. Understanding this pattern allows you to pause before interpreting every unexpected message as evidence of transformation. Sometimes the greatest surprise is not that they returned, but that they returned only after they sensed they were truly losing access to you. One of the greatest misconceptions about narcissistic relationships is the belief that preserving the relationship is always the narcissist's highest priority. In many cases, what matters even more is preserving the image they have created. This is why their behavior after you leave can seem so contradictory. They may have ignored your emotional needs, dismissed your concerns, or even treated you with indifference while the relationship was intact. Yet once you are gone, they suddenly become deeply concerned about how the breakup is perceived by friends, family, coworkers, or anyone who witnesses the change. The relationship may have ended, but the need to protect their public identity often remains as strong as ever. For someone with pronounced narcissistic traits, reputation can become closely tied to self-worth. Being seen as successful, desirable, or in control provides reassurance that supports their self-image. When a partner leaves permanently, especially after recognizing unhealthy patterns, that carefully managed image can feel threatened. Questions may arise that they would rather avoid. Why did the relationship end? Who chose to leave? Was their behavior that pushed someone away? Rather than sitting with those uncomfortable possibilities, they may focus on controlling the narrative instead. This is why some narcissists begin telling selective versions of the story. They may present themselves as the victim, describe you as unstable or ungrateful, or leave out important details that would require personal accountability. Others move quickly into a new relationship and make sure everyone notices, hoping the appearance of happiness will suggest that they were never affected. Some become unusually active on social media, posting carefully curated moments designed to communicate that life has never been better. These behaviors are often less about genuine emotional recovery and more about restoring the image they believe others should see. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why their public behavior and private behavior can be so different. A person may appear confident, cheerful, and completely unaffected while privately struggling with the loss of control or validation the relationship once provided. Image management is not the same as emotional healing. Looking strong does not necessarily mean feeling secure. When you recognize that appearances can be part of the pattern, you become less likely to compare your private healing with their public performance. Real recovery happens quietly, through honesty, reflection, and emotional growth, not through convincing everyone else that nothing ever happened. There comes a moment in many narcissistic relationship dynamics when something fundamentally changes. It is not the day you stop arguing. It is not the day you block their number or move to a new chapter of your life. The real turning point happens when they finally realize that your emotional availability is gone, not temporarily, not as a strategy, but permanently. This realization often creates a reaction that is far more significant than many people expect because it signals the end of their influence, not simply the end of the relationship. In the past, they may have believed that no matter how distant they became or how poorly they treated you, you would eventually return. Perhaps previous breakups ended with reconciliation, or your empathy led you to give another chance. Over time, this pattern can create a false sense of certainty. They begin to assume that your patience has no limit and that your presence is guaranteed. When that assumption is suddenly proven wrong, it forces them to confront a reality they never anticipated. For the first time, they recognize that they no longer have reliable access to your attention, reassurance, or emotional energy. This shift often explains why their behavior can become so inconsistent. Some become unexpectedly persistent, reaching out through messages, mutual acquaintances, or carefully timed encounters. Others react with anger or indifference, insisting they never cared in the first place. These responses may seem opposite, but they often stem from the same uncomfortable realization. The familiar dynamic is no longer under their control. The certainty they once relied upon has disappeared, and they are left trying to regain a sense of stability in whatever way feels most effective. For the person who has chosen to leave, this stage can be emotionally confusing. The sudden increase in attention may feel like proof that they have finally changed or that they now understand your worth. But lasting transformation is measured by consistent accountability, empathy, and respect for boundaries over time, not by urgency created through loss. A permanent change in behavior requires deep self-reflection and sustained effort, not simply the discomfort of losing influence. When you understand what truly shifts at this stage, the narcissist's reaction becomes easier to interpret. The surprise is often not that they respond so strongly, but that the strongest response appears only after they realize the door they assumed would always remain open has finally closed. When a narcissist realizes that you are truly gone, their emotional experience often does not unfold in a straightforward or predictable way. Unlike healthy grief, which gradually moves toward acceptance through reflection and emotional processing, the reaction can become a cycle of shifting emotions that revolve around protecting the self rather than understanding the relationship. This is one reason their behavior may seem confusing. One day they appear completely unaffected. The next day they seem angry, nostalgic, or determined to reconnect. These rapid changes can leave people wondering whether the narcissist ever knew what they truly felt. The cycle often begins with denial. They may convince themselves that your departure is temporary or that you will eventually return, just as you may have after previous disagreements. This belief allows them to avoid confronting the reality that the relationship has genuinely ended. When it becomes increasingly clear that you are not coming back, denial often gives way to frustration or anger. Rather than asking why the relationship deteriorated, they may focus on blaming you, criticizing your decisions, or convincing themselves that you were never worthy of them in the first place. Shifting responsibility outward helps protect a fragile sense of self from uncomfortable feelings of failure or rejection. As time passes, another pattern may emerge. They may begin carefully managing how others perceive the situation while simultaneously searching for new sources of validation. Some move quickly into another relationship, hoping that fresh admiration or attention will restore the confidence that was shaken by your absence. Others become more active on social media or emphasize achievements, appearances, or success. These behaviors can create the impression that they have moved on effortlessly, but external displays are not reliable indicators of inner emotional stability. Despite these efforts, there can also be quiet moments of emptiness. Without the familiar cycle of attention, conflict, reconciliation, or control, they may experience feelings they struggle to understand or tolerate. Instead of exploring those emotions with honesty and accountability, they often seek distraction through new relationships, accomplishments, or external praise. The underlying discomfort remains unresolved because the focus stays on replacing what was lost rather than examining why it was lost. Recognizing this emotional cycle helps remove much of the mystery surrounding their reactions. What appears to be confidence one week and desperation the next is often less about genuine emotional growth and more about an ongoing effort to protect a vulnerable self-image. Understanding that pattern allows you to stop measuring your healing by their changing behavior and begin trusting the quiet, steady progress of your own recovery. Few things are more unsettling to a narcissist than genuine silence. not the kind of silence that waits for a response or secretly hopes to be noticed, but the kind that comes from emotional detachment and a decision to move forward. Many people assume silence is simply the absence of communication. In reality, it is often the absence of access. When you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your choices, stop reacting to provocations, and stop looking for validation from someone who repeatedly dismissed your feelings, the entire dynamic begins to change. What once felt familiar and predictable is suddenly no longer available. In unhealthy relationship patterns, emotional reactions can become a source of reinforcement. Every argument, every attempt to prove your intentions, every emotional explanation keeps the connection alive, even when the interaction is painful. A narcissist may learn that criticism will lead you to defend yourself, withdrawal will make you chase them, or mixed signals will keep you emotionally invested. Over time, these predictable responses create a cycle that gives them a sense of influence over the relationship. They come to expect that no matter what happens, they can still shape your emotional state. Your silence interrupts that cycle. When messages receive no emotional reaction, when guilt no longer changes your decisions, and when manipulation no longer produces the desired response, familiar strategies lose much of their effectiveness. This is why silence can feel surprisingly powerful. It is not powerful because it punishes the other person. It is powerful because it reflects a shift within you. You are no longer organizing your emotional life around their behavior. Instead, your energy is being directed toward your own healing, boundaries, and peace of mind. This change often creates confusion for the narcissist. They may increase their efforts to get a reaction, alternating between kindness and hostility, nostalgia and blame, affection and criticism. The goal is often the same: to discover whether they still have emotional access. If you respond as you once did, the old pattern can quickly restart. But if your silence is grounded in genuine emotional freedom rather than strategy, there is very little for manipulation to attach itself to. That is why your silence becomes so significant. It is not about winning a psychological battle or proving a point. It is evidence that your well-being no longer depends on someone else's approval, attention, or opinion. And when your inner stability replaces emotional reactivity, you take away the one thing unhealthy dynamics rely on most: the ability to keep you emotionally revolving around them. The greatest surprise after leaving a narcissistic relationship is often not what happens to them. It is what begins to happen to you. For a long time, you may have believed that your healing depended on receiving an apology, hearing an admission of wrongdoing, or watching them finally understand the pain they caused. Those desires are completely understandable because the human mind naturally seeks closure after confusing or emotionally exhausting experiences. But as recovery progresses, something far more meaningful begins to take place. You slowly realize that your peace no longer depends on whether they ever change. It depends on the changes you make within yourself. Healing is not about becoming colder, more suspicious, or emotionally unavailable. It is about learning to recognize unhealthy patterns before they become familiar again. It means rebuilding trust in your own judgment after months or even years of questioning your reality. It means understanding that healthy love does not require constant confusion, emotional instability, or endless attempts to prove your worth. As your confidence returns, you become less likely to mistake intensity for intimacy or manipulation for affection. The qualities you begin to value are consistency, accountability, empathy, and mutual respect. One of the most important changes is emotional independence. There may have been a time when a message from them could determine your entire day, when their approval lifted your mood or their criticism shattered your confidence. As you heal, that emotional dependence gradually fades. Their opinions lose the power they once held because your sense of identity is no longer built around their perception of you. This is not indifference born from bitterness. It is emotional freedom earned through self-awareness and growth. Ironically, this inner transformation often changes the entire dynamic. When you no longer seek revenge, no longer monitor their life, and no longer feel compelled to explain yourself, the unhealthy cycle has nothing left to feed on. You stop participating in the emotional patterns that once kept you trapped. Whether they understand what they lost or continue repeating the same behaviors with others becomes a question that no longer controls your future. That is the true ending of this story. The most powerful response to manipulation is not proving your value to someone who refused to see it. It is building a life where your value is no longer something another person has the power to define. When your healing becomes stronger than your need for answers, you reclaim the one thing that was always meant to belong to you: your peace, your clarity, and your freedom. If there is one truth to remember, it is this: the narcissist's reaction after you are gone forever is not the measure of your worth. Whether they become angry, try to return, rewrite the past, or pretend you never mattered, their response reflects their own psychological patterns, not your value as a person. The mistake many people make is believing that healing is complete only when the narcissist finally understands what they lost. But real healing begins the moment you stop waiting for that realization. The greatest victory is not watching someone regret losing you. The greatest victory is reaching a place where their regret, or lack of it, no longer determines your emotional state. That is what genuine freedom looks like. It is waking up without replaying old conversations. It is trusting your own judgment again. It is no longer questioning whether you deserved better, because you already know the answer. Healthy relationships are never built on fear, confusion, or the constant need to earn love. They are built on mutual respect, emotional safety, accountability, and empathy. Once you experience that difference, it becomes much harder to settle for less. The lessons you learned through pain become the boundaries that protect your future. So, if you have walked away, stay committed to your healing. Let your silence remain peaceful, not punitive. Let your boundaries remain firm, not hostile. And let your future be guided by clarity rather than by the hope that someone who repeatedly refused to change will suddenly become the person you always needed them to be. Because in the end, the most surprising reaction is not theirs. It is yours. One day, you will realize that the person who once occupied your every thought has become a chapter instead of your entire story. You will no longer be searching for closure because you will have created it yourself. And that is the moment you truly win, not by changing them, but by finally choosing yourself.